Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England, whose purpose is to uncover and promote authors with new ideas to society's oldest problems, especially economic ones. Today we're celebrating the release of the ebook edition of Rent Unmasked, How to Save the Global Economy and to Build a Sustainable Future, essays in honour of the late great Mason Gaffney, edited by Fred Harrison. For the next few podcasts, I'll be interviewing contributors to the book, and today I'm interviewing Francis K. Peddle, a leading tax lawyer and professor of philosophy at the Dominican University College, Ottawa, Canada. Francis is a past president of the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation and was a deputy editor of the International Journal of Social Economics. He's written a number of books and essays, and he's also the co-editor and contributor to the 6th-volume annotated works of Henry George. Well, thanks so much for agreeing to talk.
Yep, happy to be here.
Could you just to give the listeners just an idea of where you're from? Could you give us a sense of your background and how you came to contribute to Rent Unmasked?
Well, my background is in two disciplines. I was a tax lawyer here in Ottawa, Canada, for many years, and I was also a philosophy professor. And I knew Mason Gaffney since the early 1990s. I had met him at a conference in Philadelphia in 1989, and then I met him at the next conference in London in 1991, and we developed a pretty good working relationship after that. And also we served on the board of the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation in New York back in the early 2000s. So I saw him a fair bit. And the reason why I think the editor, Fred Harrison, asked me to contribute to this volume, though, is not primarily because I was somebody who knew a few things about vicissitudes of tax law, but he wanted me to contribute to it in terms of what the basic philosophy was of Mason Gaffney and what the origins of that was.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, then I was much happier to contribute to the volume than to write a more arcane piece on tax law.
Well, I mean, the chapter that you wrote is certainly very readable. I just wonder, I mean, a lot of if we've got our committed listeners, and they will remember the stuff we did on the corruption of economics with Fred, and got into that book. I just wondered, could you just briefly explain to the listeners who Mason Gaffney was?
Well, Mason Gaffney was since after the Second World War, he served in the Second World War, but right after that, he got his education, and he became one of the primary economists I would say in the Western world on the economics of land and the economics of the yields that come from land. And he looked at that from many different perspectives over his long career. He only died in 2020. He was well into his 90s at that point. And he looked at it from the standpoint of, say, agriculture, timber rights, water rights, and so on. So over this period, he was an academic primarily. He contributed to many different fields with respect to the nature of economic rent. And also he was the premier economist in the post-Second World War period in trying to amplify and engage the modern world of economics with the older philosophy of Henry George, who worked in the second half of the 19th century. George was his inspiration, for sure, but he was able to really use his very innovative ideas to apply those theories of George to the world and the issues we have today, basically.
Mm.
And also, I had a more of a connection with him here in Canada as well. As in the early 1970s, there was a government called the Barrett government in British Columbia. And one of the principal people in that government, cabinet minister, was Bob Williams, who was a minister of resources and basically the minister of land. And he invited Mason to come and set up a Institute for Economic Policy Analysis in BC, which he did. Mason went there in 1973 and was there for three or 4 years or so before he moved on to eventually ended up in California at University of Riverside, University of California at Riverside, I should say. And at that time, the interesting side of this, and I know Bob Williams well since the 1990s also. I just went to his memorial service in Vancouver in September here in Canada, and it was quite an event with former premiers and a lot of key people in political and economic life in British Columbia showed up for that. And Bob was also, like Mason Gaffney, a very much a follower of Henry George. One of the interesting things, though, is that after that, the government in BC wanted to reform the BC Assessment Authority, and they invited Ted Gaffney, who was also a contributor to this book, Rent Unmasked, to come and reform the BC Assessment Authority and try to make it do its job properly, because they had a lot of issues. Each little municipality was doing its own assessments, and it wasn't very professionalized and so on. But also they wanted to make sure that they kept good land value maps and land value assessments in BC and keep the building value and the land value separate. So Ted was there, and Ted became the head of the BC Assessment Authority until 1986. And that assessment authority today, of all the provinces in Canada, is recognized as the premier assessment authority. It does its work the best of anyone here in Canada. And I know that well because as a tax lawyer, I did a lot of property tax appeals here in Ontario, and the assessment system here is terrible. So we have in a way to Mason to thank for that too. So that's one of the Canadian connections. Right?
Fantastic. And the intention of writing the book, Rent Unmasked,
I think it was trying to bring to a very wide and diverse audience various aspects of Mason's philosophy and his economics. I in the philosophy discipline, I would use the phrase philosophy of economics. But Mason did it in a way that I think was pretty unique, because what he was trying to do is he viewed George as a reconciler. He didn't view him just being an economist for this discipline or that discipline and so on. He saw him in a broad reconciling sense, and I mean it this way, that economics, mainstream economics in the 20th century was mostly about trade-offs. If you wanted to have, say, greater distributional fairness, distributional fairness in society, you would focus on taxation, but that would have consequences for efficiency and productivity, because taxes on labor and consumption are primarily dead weight, and they tend to reduce productivity in society. If you wanted to have, though, greater efficiency, you would have to push for less taxation and a more middleist sort of government. And Mason said that was a false choice, and he did it in many different areas. And he tried to expose all these false choices and to give us what I would call then, and I subtitled this in the piece I did in the book, a philosophy of reconciliation. And in that sense, I think he was very much in the spirit of what Henry George was trying to do in the 19th century. George was, often called a Marxist and a socialist by some people who didn't know anything about him. And Karl Marx wasn't that happy about him, called him the last bastion of freebooting capitalism. And other people called him, a communist and a land nationalist, which he wasn't either. So often when both sides are attacking you on the political spectrum, you might be doing something right. And George was really trying to reconcile these things, right? He gave people, for instance, all their property rights that they would have. You could still own land in a sense of having fee simple rights, but you wouldn't have an entitlement to the yield or the economic rent that comes off that land. That's why we called it Rent Unmasked, because we're really talking about economic rent there, not contractual rent like we would have between, say, you're renting an apartment or a car. So in that way, Mason was able to say, yes, you can have a tax system that is significantly reduces taxes on productivity, that is on labor and on consumption. Consumption is, the final stage, if you like, of productivity. And you could complement that by taxation on economic rent, that is keeping economic rent for public purposes, not letting it be privatized. And you can protect individual property rights and rights that you have to your own labor and the produce of your own labor and so on, without negating what society needs to, have public works and benefits. George generally had a relatively minimalist view of government, although he said there would be things that government would do better than the private sector. So, for instance, he would be okay with public utilities and things of that sort. So ultimately, then, I think that was the goal there, at least of my piece, to give a broad sense then of how these reconciliations would contribute to the common good, I called it in the piece. But the book as a whole did it in many different areas as well. If you read all the individual pieces, there's stuff on, for instance, tax wars and tariffs. Tariffs become, since the election yesterday in the United States, tariffs have become a big issue. And will become a big issue, I should think, in the next few years. There's stuff in there on farming. There's all kinds of various ways in which what I think the editor of this series would call a philosophy of abundance from different aspects, but they would all contribute to the common good. And my view and my approach in my piece was to give a more philosophical and total picture of that. Although I did describe some specific reconciliations in the latter part of the piece.
And could you talk about common goods, and I just wondered, is that the same as that something's in the common good, and if not, what distinction do you make?
Well, things come into the common good in different ways. Okay, I mean, obviously there's productivity of material goods. Those are tangible goods. Economists will call that arrivalist goods. But then other things come into or are a part of the common good that are more intangible. And for instance, just access to a park, for instance, just because I go to a park, that doesn't negate you from going to the park and so on, although it would depend on some congestion issues of too many of us went. But, we think of that in terms of the internet today, access to the internet. My accessing the internet it's non-rivalous because it doesn't negate somebody else getting access to the internet as far as we can see, although there's certain portal gatekeepers or portal people who do put some restrictions on these things. So there are issues around that. But I think we want to use the term then, at least was my intention in this piece, to use it in the broadest way of intangible. So, for instance, something intangible that we would all want to subscribe to in our societies, fairness in taxation. We would all want to talk about advancing productivity, for instance. We would think that that's a good thing, right? But our current system doesn't do that. The current tax system, in many ways, throws what we call, technically in economics, dead weight losses on productivity, and that then would be a taking away from the common good. But that's a more tangible thing in a way, but it's also, if you look at it in conjunction with other things like fairness in taxation, or trying to encourage, what sometimes use the phrase tax bad's not good, trying to, use the tax system to some degree as a social engineering tool to tax those things that are bad and not to tax the things that are good. So, for instance, when it comes to your house, the tax on the land would be a tax that is good in a way, because it doesn't negate productivity, whereas a tax on the improvements on the house does negate productivity. So that's a bad part of it. So we would want to take the tax off those capital investments or the house and the improvements and shift it to the other side. Now, our system today does the reversal. The problem with trying to get this philosophy across to many people is that the whole thing has been inverted. So what we do is we kind of subsidize the bads today and tax the goods. So we're trying to do these inversions. And actually, Mason's work is very good at that, at trying to show how we don't need to get into these trade-offs, which is the term I use a lot in my piece, between, say, investing and savings. People are trying to get businesses to invest. We tax consumption. One justification for that is would encourage savings and so on. So what you want then is you want all these various things in, I suppose you might call it social capital, although I don't particularly like that phrase because it is a rather vague thing. But traditionally people would, back centuries ago, talk about the common good in political philosophy and that as sort of this intangible thing that would contribute to the overall sense of well-being in society. Society is more today in conflict a lot because I don't think the tax system is fair. And therefore, because of that, I'm perfectly justified in trying to game the system in some way, right? And people think, well, the rich people, they can hire all kinds of lawyers and accountants to game the system. And that's really unfair. And so I could go and cheat a bit and participate in the underground economy. We, like in England, have a very high consumption tax here called the HST, or the harmonized sales tax. It's like a value-added tax, right? And there's a lot, it just contributes to an underground economy because people do all these petty transactions that are cash only or not in the system. Well, I think in that sense, that is probably more important for the advance of society as a whole, but economic systems as well, because what it does is it leads more to cooperation amongst people than to just every individual for himself because he thinks the system is unfair.
Yeah. I don't know. I think Mason's on the record of saying that if you are in a corrupt system, then it's only reasonable that you're going to act in a way that is to minimize the effect of the corruption on you individually, which then makes it worse for others. Right.
And that's, if I may diverse a bit into or I should say digress, but this is a diverse topic that Henry George contributed to quite a bit in a book called Protection of Free Trade, which is volume 4 of the annotated works of Henry George, which myself and Bill Peirce at Case Western Reserve University, the co-editors, we put out over the last 8 years a 6-volume work of all of George's major works with critical annotations and new scholarly introductions and the title of the whole series is The Annotated Works of Henry George. But volume 4 in that series is Protection of Free Trade. Now, interestingly enough, outside the world of people who know a lot about Henry George, that is the book that is followed the most in mainstream economics, because the vast majority of people in mainstream economics will be supporters of free trade in one way or another, or managed trade or things like that. And they will go to George's text on free trade to justify. I mean, they see a great justification because it's such an elegant and coherent argument for free trade in sort of the purest sense. And it was actually one of the first books, one of the few books read into the congressional record in the United States in its totality. Well, a congressman who was a Georgist at the time arranged for 6 other congressmen to read 4 or 5 chapters in every session into it. And the reason why they did that, because they could then have the transcript sent for free by Congress to their constituents, to the voters. And then Congress had to put it, then everybody started reading their books into the congressional record, and Congress then had to put a stop to it because it got too expensive. It said, you can only do that if a supermajority of Congress agrees to put your whole book into the record. Otherwise, you're limited to 2 pages to send to your constituents. So George was responsible for a lot of things in history that, and a lot of laws that people don't know about, like how the budget of 1909 provoked a constitutional crisis in England with respect to the House of Lords, right? So these are sort of the hidden histories behind it. So on the tariff question, though, what we're looking at now, to get back to the corruption issue, is, well, you're going to see massive corruption here if, say, the U.S. starts trade wars, tariff wars with Europe, with Canada. Would be very, very detrimental to Canada. We are the U.S.'s largest trading partner. $2 billion worth of trade goes over the border every day with the U.S. 75% of our exports are to the U.S. U.S. does export a lot here, but we are very dependent on that pretty much open border. And it's very complicated because a car being manufactured in either the U.S. or Canada crosses the border 6 times before it's completely produced, because of the relationship between the auto body parts industry and the assembling industry and the car manufacturing in Canada and the United States. So I just don't know how they would be able to put, say, a 10% tariff on it, which is what is being talked about. But generally speaking, what's going to happen then very quickly is people are going to start jockeying for exemptions, as our government already is doing. And you're going to get different industries pitted against each other, and you're going to get countries going at war with each other, and it's going to be like back in the 60s with nuclear weapons. It's going to be mutually assured destruction, because we'll all be going to the bottom on putting these massive tariffs on to retaliate against the Americans if they do it to us. So everybody's kind of, especially here in Canada, very nervous about this. Well, it'll also, in the United States, I think, make the whole issue very much of a corruption issue, because every business sector is going to try to, get their own piece of the action there, so to speak. They want some protections, but the other ones might want to be have exemptions for things because their industry is in a critical industry sector, right? Like the U.S. doesn't produce much aluminum. We produce most of the aluminum that goes in the United States, and that's a key component in a lot of things. And well, just look at the beer industry in the United States. They get most of their cans. They wouldn't have their cans, right, if it wasn't for Canadian aluminum. And we could do it because we have a lot of hydropower. Aluminum plants use up a lot of power. And so is the aluminum industry going to seek an exemption? We've already been through this in the first Trump term. Is it going to happen again? I don't know. Will they look upon that as a critical sector that, this goes to, their whole they'll put it under the national security umbrella, right? Because it would take them 20 years to build aluminum plants, and they wouldn't be able to find enough power for it. So this is going to go on and on and on, and it will be a race to the bottom in terms of corruption, and other things, bad things will happen from it too. Inflation, you will get a loss of productivity. We've already had some just based on a 10% across the board tariff. We've already had a very significant projection from some of the economists here in Canada of a significant loss in productivity, almost up to 2% of GDP after if you did it across the board. So people are worried about just the general fall off in the economy as well, and it could provoke a recession. So many, many things would come from that will be not helpful. And I haven't even gotten into what would happen with Europe when they start to do this.
No, I think so. And so if you were going to take the advice from Henry George on tariffs, what would you recommend to the incoming President Trump?
Don't do it. I mean, you just, it's not, he has this view, and there are some people around him, it's that this will, it's tied into this American isolationist philosophy, right? That you would encourage American manufacturing. That's an old argument, man. Encourage infant industry in George's time, but encourage American manufacturing. And it's a way of walling America off, right? Because Americans that would also start buying more American products, they wouldn't. Presumably, that's the goal. Back in the late 19th century, most manufacturing in the United States, the products of that manufacturing was consumed in the United States, right? Now, America is not as dependent on exports as much as, say, Germany. I don't know the figures there, or France, but certainly Canada. We are an export economy. Most of the houses built in the United States are built with Canadian lumber, for instance. Softwood lumber industry is Massimo. We were always in disputes with the Americans over that. They don't like the way we subsidize, our dairy industry and some other things, but they subsidize their farming to an incredible extent, as well as the same as you do in the UK. I mean, farming all around the world seems to be subsidized in one form.
Yeah. Yeah. You say in your chapter about, you quote Friedman's, "There's no such thing as a free lunch," and you say it's wrong, and also, why is it also damaging for society?
Right. Well, Friedman is basically using an either or. When he says there's no free lunch, what he means by that is taxes as they are today are either on income or consumption. So if you want government to produce a good, you've got to pay for it, and you're going to pay for it out of taxation, which is coming out of your pocket. Funnily enough, though, Friedman contradicted himself in other places. If he really knew Mason Gaffney's philosophy on this, because he said, well, the least bad tax is the Henry George land value tax. And so that's somewhat in conflict with his idea that there's no free lunch. So that goes again to this philosophy of trade-offs. Either you have equity or efficiency. And that's the background. That's the philosophical background, if you like, for no free lunch.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a judge in the U.S. as well who famously said along those lines, and I don't know if Friedman got this from him or not, but it said the taxes are the price we pay for civilization, which means, they're a necessary evil. Right?
So if Trump and also, I mean, in the UK, we've got there's a change in the tax laws for our farmers, which is introducing inheritance tax for all but the smallest of farms, which is causing protest and a lot of anger in the community. What could a leader do to improve revenue, but also to increase fairness by applying the principles that you talk about and your colleagues talk about in Rent Unmasked?
The issue of farming is always used as a kind of hiding behind something to say you don't want to do a land value tax. Now, people support what Gaffney proposes, say, well, you really have to tax all land. But we know that farmland in England and here in Canada too is overvalued. If you look at Duncan Pickett's piece in the book, which is on farming, and he was a Scottish farmer, he knows a lot about it, ran a farm up there for many years, you will see some of the basic issues that need to be addressed around this. And what you want to do is, of course, you have to assess all land, and then you have to say, put a tax on it, and then you get into, well, do you want to have farming as a class unto itself that has a lower rate on it? Or do you want to, treat it very differently, which we do now? Do we want to continue this tradition, treat it very differently from urban land, land that is zoned, say, commercial or residential within a municipal or local authority environment? And that's where the whole debate around this is going to be joined. And so the inheritance issue is then made a secondary issue. This is yet another example of how the current tax system foments social conflict, because in a way that you wouldn't need an inheritance tax, because the land will be appropriately and not haphazardly valued within society, if that is farmland, for instance, and people will care about it a lot less. And we got rid of inheritance taxes here in Canada in the early 1970s and substituted a capital gains tax. So most of our arguments are around a capital gains tax, and I think in a pure Georgia system, there would be no capital gains taxes. But you have to realize that most capital gains are land gains, really, anyway, and that's certainly the farming sector. A lot of farmers are there just to be speculators in their land and not to actually be farmers. So one thing this would do is would let farmers be farmers again, and not something else, not financializing agricultural land. Same goes through for developers. Developers are only got a bad sort of, shall I say, a bad reputation in our society, put it euphemistically, because a lot of people really hate them because they're speculators as well. So, but if you just let them be developers and not be land speculators, they're doing a good thing for society. And that's again what happens in terms of the common good when you have a tax system like ours that's sort of piecemeal and transactional. Okay, the Georgia system is not transactional, and that's a big thing with tariffs as well. But what it does is it taxes inert property, and there doesn't have to be an economic event or an economic transaction in order for the tax to be liable, right? Or the charge to be liable. So, for instance, a death is a transaction of some sort in the family, or a change of ownership, consumption. Buying something is a transaction, earning a wage is a transaction. Everything in our system is based on there being some kind of transaction. This is the hardest part to understand what Gaffney is talking about, and George as well, that we have to move away from that. We have to move away from this type of estimation of what taxable capacity is in terms of this event that happens where you make some kind of judgment as a government about, that event's going to happen, me purchasing something, and therefore I will tax it. Now, governments, of course, have got to say, well, that's easy stuff to get at, right? Because there's always going to be purchases, and there's always going to be wage income. So therefore, it's easier to get at. We can track it. The whole system is, in that way, for us, much more reliable. Now, the counter argument to that, of course, is, again, that's another false dichotomy. And that's why I think Gaffney is so important here. We've got to stop being presented with false dichotomies all the time when we talk to our policymakers, because that's how they always come back. That's their mindset. And so, for instance, if you're going to say, okay, me purchasing something is good because that's the end game of manufacturing and production. So, everything heads to consumption in that sense. That's good for society. There's no consumers, and the economy collapses, right? Or economic production is no longer viable. Then you say, well, you're going to tax it because it's just sort of there, right? It's an event, and that's the trade-off. I'm trying to, the government would say then, or the policymakers would say, well, I'm going to give a trade-off. I have to have this money for public revenue, for benefits to society, for NHS and things like that. But also, I'm just going to do it enough. Okay. They always say, we'll just do it enough not to ruin it. But nobody knows what enough is, because I think the VAT in England now is up around 20%, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the HST here in Canada, in Ontario, is 13%. So that's a big chunk. And when you put it together with income tax and property tax, a substantial amount of your wage income is going to taxes. The other thing is, it's not transparent, though. The argument here is that these things are transparent, and they're not. I could ask anybody here in Canada how much VAT or HST they paid last year, and they could find it out, but they cannot give you an answer because it's on every transaction. And you would have to add up every receipt and every little thing that you did for the past year to know how much tax you're going to make. We can kind of make estimates because we know what people spend on groceries on average and so on. But it's not that transparent how much tax you actually pay. And of course, the income tax system is not transparent either, because it's as I say in the book, it's a surrealistic zigzag pagoda of pestilent greed, to use Ferdinand Lundberg's phrase for it. And because who knows what the exemptions and tax credits and various things that you get, right? It's just impossible for you to know what the person next door is paying in taxation. But if you had land value maps and a land value tax, you would know exactly what every piece of land is paying. We have access to land registries. We can create these land value maps, which, by the way, they're doing in Ireland right now around the 31 local authorities in Ireland because they're moving to something that's interesting there. It's not a pure George's move, but it's called a residentially zoned land tax in Ireland, and the Parliament there just passed it last year, and it's being implemented as we speak. Right? Just go to the website of any law firm in Ireland, and you will see their advice on how to deal with it, right, to their clients.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Before I wrap up, is there anything? What do you say would be the main reasons for someone to read Rent Unmasked?
Well, I think if people are motivated for economic justice and social justice issues, this gives you a lot of platform to deal with that in a way that's very innovative and nobody is talking about today. So it's a real niche thing like that. And it's very good to help you or your movement as well. If you're an activist in some sense, you've got a sound philosophy behind it. Secondly, if you're working in a certain sector for social justice, that is affordable housing, or you're working in farming, around farming issues and that, there's stuff in there for you on that. There's stuff in there on the tariff issue for that. So it's quite an incredible array of documents that come before you. The other thing is, I think it's pretty reasonable. It's not a technical volume. One of the most technical things that Mason wrote is a thing. I published it in a special issue of the International Journal of Social Economics in 2009. But it all revolves. The main part of this special issue is Mason's piece on the hidden taxable capacity of land, which is a very technical thing, and it sets out research agendas for economists and academics and so on. This book doesn't really do that. This book is good for people to attune them to the issues that are there in real estate, and to see in a very global sense why real estate is such a key aspect to everything we do in society today. The affordable housing crisis, to government deficits, to all of these things. And if you want an overview of how to deal with that in a non-technical, sort of generally non-academic way, although there's lots of references if you want to read further in each article in the book, I think that's why it's a really good place to go.
Brilliant. That was it. That was a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for your time.
Nice meeting you, Jonathan. And say hi to Phil Anderson. I haven't seen him in many years. I think I've met him a few times. And but I also knew Anthony Ranner really well. Not really well, but pretty well.
Certainly will.
He's a great loss. Yeah.
Yeah, he is. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit Shepheard-Walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers, and also to buy the books. So until next time, keep reading.